It was not only in Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley that men were settling down to agriculture and the formation of city-states in the centuries between 600 and 800 BC. Wherever there were possibilities of irrigation and a steady all-the-year-round food supply, men were exchanging the uncertainties and hardships of hunting and wandering for the routines of settlement. On the upper Tigris, a people called the Assyrians were founding cities. In the valleys of Asia Minor and on the Mediterranean shores and islands, there were small communities growing up to civilization. Possibly parallel developments of human life were already going on in favorable regions of India and China. In many parts of Europe where there were lakes well stocked with fish, little communities of men had long settled in dwellings built on piles over the water, and were eking out agriculture by fishing and hunting. But over much larger areas of the Old World no such settlement was possible. The land was too harsh, too thickly wooded, or too arid, or the seasons too uncertain for mankind, with only the implements and science of that age to take root. For settlement under the conditions of the primitive civilizations, men needed a constant water supply and warmth and sunshine. Where these needs were not satisfied, man could live as a transient, as a hunter following his game, as a herdsman following the seasonal grass, but he could not settle. The transition from the hunting to the herding life may have been very gradual. From following herds of wild cattle or, in Asia, wild horses, men may have come to an idea of property in them, have learned to pen them into valleys, have fought for them against wolves, wild dogs, and other predatory beasts. Pottery and implements of the lake dwellers. Pottery and implements of the lake dwellers. Brit. Muse. A contemporary lake village. A contemporary lake village. These Borneo dwellings are practically counterparts of the homes of European Neolithic communities 600 BC. So while the primitive civilizations of the cultivators were growing up chiefly in the great river valleys, a different way of living, the nomadic life, a life in constant movement to and fro from winter pasture to summer pasture, was also growing up. The nomadic peoples were on the whole hardier than the agriculturalists. They were less prolific and numerous, they had no permanent temples and no highly organized priesthood, they had less gear, but the reader must not suppose that theirs was necessarily a less highly developed way of living on that account. In many ways this free life was a fuller life than that of the tillers of the soil. The individual was more self-reliant, less of a unit in a crowd. The leader was more important, the medicine man perhaps less so. Nomads in Egypt. Nomads in Egypt. Nomads in Egypt. Egyptian wall painting in a tomb near ancient Beni Hassan, Middle Egypt. It depicts the arrival of a tribe of Semitic nomads in Egypt about the year of 1895 BC. Moving over large stretches of country, the nomad took a wider view of life. He touched on the confines of this settled land and that. He was used to the sight of strange faces. He had to scheme and treat for pasture with competing tribes. He knew more of minerals than the folk upon the plowlands because he went over mountain passes and into rocky places. He may have been a better metallurgist. Possibly bronze and much more probably iron smelting were nomadic discoveries. Some of the earliest implements of iron reduced from its ores have been found in Central Europe far away from the early civilizations. Flint knives of 4500 BC. Flint knives of 4500 BC. Excavated 1922 by the British School of Archaeology in Egypt from First Dynasty tombs. On the other hand, the settled folk had their textiles and their pottery and made many desirable things. It was inevitable that as the two sorts of life, the agricultural and the nomadic, differentiated, a certain amount of looting and trading should develop between the two. In Sumeria particularly, which had deserts and seasonal country on either hand, it must have been usual to have the nomads camping close to the cultivated fields, trading and stealing and perhaps tinkering, as gypsies do to this day. But hens they would not steal, because the domestic fowl, an Indian jungle fowl, originally was not domesticated by man until about 1000 BC. They would bring precious stones and things of metal and leather. If they were hunters, they would bring skins. They would get in exchange pottery and beads and glass, garments, and such like manufactured things. Egypt peasants going to work. Egypt peasants going to work. From an ancient and curiously painted model in the British Museum. 3 main regions and 3 main kinds of wandering and imperfectly settled people there were in those remote days of the first civilizations in Sumeria and early Egypt. Away in the forests of Europe were the blond Nordic peoples, hunters and herdsmen, a lowly race. The primitive civilization saw very little of this race before 1500 BC. Away on the steppes of Eastern Asia, various Mongolian tribes, the Hunnish peoples, were domesticating the horse and developing a very wide sweeping habit of seasonal movement between their summer and winter camping places. Possibly the Nordic and Hunnish peoples were still separated from one another by the swamps of Russia and the greater Caspian Sea of that time. For very much of Russia there was swamp and lake. In the deserts, which were growing more arid now, of Syria and Arabia, tribes of a dark white or brownish people, the Semitic tribes, were driving flocks of sheep and goats and asses from pasture to pasture. It was these Semitic shepherds and certain more negroid people from southern Persia, the Elamites, who were the first nomads to come into close contact with the early civilizations. They came as traders and as raiders. Finally there arose leaders among them with bolder imaginations, and they became conquerors. Stele glorifying King Naram-Sin, of Akkad. Stele glorifying King Naram-Sin, of Akkad. This monarch, son of Sargon I, was a great architect as well as a famous conqueror. Discovered in 1898 among the ruins of Susa, Persia. About 2750 BC, a great Semitic leader, Sargon, had conquered the whole Sumerian land and was master of all the world from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. He was an illiterate barbarian, and his people, the Akkadians, learnt the Sumerian writing and adopted the Sumerian language as the speech of the officials and the learned. The empire he founded decayed after 2 centuries, and after one inundation of Elamites, a fresh Semitic people, the Amorites, by degrees established their rule over Sumeria. They made their capital in what had hitherto been a small upriver town, Babylon, and their empire is called the First Babylonian Empire. It was consolidated by a great king called Hammurabi, circa 2100 BC, who made the earliest code of laws yet known to history. The narrow valley of the Nile lies less open to nomadic invasion than Mesopotamia, but about the time of Hammurabi occurred a successful Semitic invasion of Egypt and a line of pharaohs was set up, the Hyksos or shepherd kings, which lasted for several centuries. These Semitic conquerors never assimilated themselves with the Egyptians. They were always regarded with hostility as foreigners and barbarians, and they were at last expelled by a popular uprising about 1600 BC. But the Semites had come into Sumeria for good and all. The 2 races assimilated and the Babylonian Empire became Semitic in its language and character.